here? Yes, and that'll be confirmed when you do roll. Okay, David, can you hear me? You look frozen to us. So James, are you here?
I am.
Okay.
Yeah, let me pull up the script. Okay.
David is stuck in time.
With connectivity stuff, I have often had to be pretending to have the gavel, so I'm pinch hitting here, and I apologize if anything, if I say something wrong first, somebody just jump in and correct me. Okay, so thank you all for being here this morning. I call to order the annual Port of Portland budget hearing. My name is James Offsink. I'm the Vice Chair of the Tax Supervising and Conservation Commission, and I welcome you to the hearing. I will now ask my fellow commissioners and the TSCC staff to introduce themselves and state if they have any business relationships with the district that could be perceived as a conflict of interest. Again, James Offsink, he, him, Vice Chair. I don't have any business relationships with the district, and I'll pass it over to Commissioner Norton.
Yes, good morning. I'm joining by audio only. This is Margot Norton. I am a 6-year member of the commission. I am retired, but my career was in government finance. I have no conflict with the district.
Good morning. My name is Mark Wilbold. My day job, I'm a senior policy analyst in the President's Office of Portland State. And this is my 5th year with the TSCC. Earlier, you met my grandchild. But as far as conflict of interest, my middle son is actually a union carpenter working on the port. So all of us, thank you for the work. But I personally have no conflict of interest.
Good morning. I was like, I had to check the time. Good morning, everyone. My name is Harmony Kidas. This is my 2nd year with TSCC. I work in K-12 science education. I took my first flight in a year and a half just about 10 days ago, and it was a great experience. We flew all the way to Maine, the other Portland. I have no conflict of interest with the district.
And I'm Craig Gibbons. I'm staff to the commission.
Tony Betchart, staff.
Thank you both. And then do we have Chair Behringer back? I can't actually.
I'm trying on the phone. Can you hear me?
Yep, perfect. You just want to introduce yourself, David?
Yes, I'm David Behringer, and I'm the chair of the TSCC, and I have limited bandwidth, I guess, today. Okay.
So our introductions are done, and the port, okay. If you want to introduce yourselves. And David, I'll hand it back over to you.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Great. I'll start. Good morning, Commissioners. Curtis Robinhold. I'm Executive Director at the Port. And Port team, why don't we just popcorn ourselves here? I'll hand over to Antoinette Chandler.
Good morning, TSCC. Wonderful to meet everybody for the first time today, albeit virtually. Antoinette Chandler, and I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Financial Officer to the Port of Portland.
And Antoinette, you want to hand over to your team?
Yes, I'll hand it over to Suzanne.
Good morning, Suzanne Kenny. I am the Director of Budget, Financial Planning, and Analysis. And Fran Breeding, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Fran Breeding. I'm Finance Manager of the Budget, Financial Planning, and Analysis team. It's good to see everybody today.
Great. And why don't we have members of my executive team here as well, and I think you'll be hearing from them individually later. Chris Zarnecki from our airport operations team is here. Vince Granato, who's running our PDX Next program. Keith Levitt, who is our Chief Trade and Economic Development Officer, and Kristen Leonard, who runs our, there are a couple more, sorry. Kristen Leonard is Public Affairs, Government Affairs, and Bobby Stedman, who is our Chief Administrative and Equity Officer. We also have Sean O'Halloran, who is a Port of Portland Commissioner, joining us today. So thank you all for the opportunity.
Great, so that's the end of the introductions. Okay, Thank you all for your introductions. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Port's contribution to the metro area's COVID vaccine efforts. It was great to see the Port's parking lot being used for these events. Thank you very much for making that available. The community really appreciates that. If you have any brief introductory remarks to your budget, we would like to hear them now. Then we will ask our questions and discuss the budget with you. Following today's discussion, we will take testimony from the public. Craig, has anyone signed up to make a comment?
No, no one has signed up.
Okay. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Robinhold to make his introductory remarks. Thank you.
Great. Thank you again, and thank you, commissioners, in this weird environment, and I think our second time doing it in this weird way, but thank you for your time this morning. Really good to sort of see you all again. I want to especially speak on behalf of the folks at the Port. We're grateful for the opportunity to discuss the budget with you today and answer questions you have. I do have some opening remarks, but Antoinette did already introduce herself, but Antoinette is new to us over the course of this last year. Our new Chief Financial Officer, Antoinette, joined in July last year, and we're just thrilled to have her as part of the team. Prior to joining the Port, Antoinette's been in both the public and private sector, most recently as the Assistant Treasurer for the County of Los Angeles. She's got 20 years working in the private sector as well of financial services, so just a real treat for us. And while she's been here less than a year, she's already been integral in leading the organization through the pandemic and the associated financial challenges it has wrought. Her leadership has been really fundamental in preserving liquidity and ensuring the financial stability and viability of the Port are maintained. So I, for one, certainly couldn't be more pleased to have her as part of our leadership team. And following my opening remarks, I'll have Antoinette provide some additional comments and context in the budget discussion. So, as you know, this past year has been really unlike anything anyone has experienced before. Certainly for the Port and the region, we've faced really challenging times in recent history, between the pandemic and wildfires last fall, economic recession, movements for racial justice. We've really found ourselves addressing issues not previously contemplated at the Port. The pandemic and economic recession that followed has further highlighted the stark economic and health disparities that exist in our region, especially for low-income workers and Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. We've really chosen at the Port to lean into these moments and examine how we can accelerate what we do to advance a regional economy that generates and shares wealth and economic opportunity more equitably. So as we head into this next fiscal year, we aim to find ways to use our airports, marine terminals, and development tools to create quality jobs for workers and businesses who may have been left out of the economic growth of our region for decades. This commitment to sharing prosperity isn't actually a new mission, as we actually have talked about in years past in our TSCC testimony, but it's really about thinking differently about diversity and inclusion and drawing the connections to our daily work. Our fiscal year 22 budget aligns with the Port's core values of leadership, inclusion, and service, and reflects both the economic realities facing the Port and our commitment to use the Port's resources to lift everyone in the region. To further advance this goal, we're launching a trade and equitable development department to evaluate how the Port's properties and partnerships create quality jobs and business growth for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, low-income communities, and people with disabilities. Again, groups of people who have really missed out on many of the benefits the Port has provided in the past. We also plan to assess the property and assets we own to determine how we can best leverage those assets to contribute to shared prosperity in the region. We recognize that this is not going to be easy, but it feels like the right thing. It really reflects our own commitment to utilizing the Port's assets and resources to advance shared prosperity within the region. So let me start with PDX briefly, and you'll get more detail shortly. I thank you for the call out on the vaccine clinic. It is just indicative of the wild things that have happened in this last year. I would say primarily items that we're really proud of. At PDX, the pandemic challenges continue as we've worked to manage through a recovery that's been slower than we anticipated a year ago, but is recently especially accelerating. Our fiscal 21 budget anticipated that the number of passengers utilizing the airport would be down about 50% compared to our pre-COVID level. And our projections for the year are now that we'll be down about 63% compared to our pre-COVID level for the year. On a brighter note, with the increased vaccine distribution this spring, we've really seen passenger traffic increase, primarily driven by a leisure market that's leading the recovery. Our fiscal year 22 budget is based on passenger traffic being down between 35 and 40% compared to pre-COVID levels. And while these signs are encouraging, we do know we've got a ways to go. In addition, we know that we can't take a step back from the protocols that have kept our community safe. We're committed to remain vigilant regarding health and safety protocols for employees, customers, business partners, and construction workers at PDX. And while we're still emerging from one of the most devastating years in modern history, we can enter the next fiscal year with some optimism and commitment to doing everything we can to help this region rebuild, recover, and hopefully prosper. So at this point, as promised, I'll turn it over to Antoinette to provide some additional budget highlights.
All right. Thank you, Curtis. And again, good morning, Mr. Chairman and TSCC commissioners. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all today and to discuss the Port's fiscal year 22 budget and answer any questions that you might have. This past year, managing through this pandemic has been unprecedented. I think most of us would agree, and to say the least. As someone new, to the organization, new to this industry, the effects of the pandemic has really changed the way we work, I think the way we interact with one another, and has adversely, unfortunately adversely impacted our communities both socially and economically. And as Curtis mentioned, we're seeing some bright spots. We are cautiously optimistic, but we're definitely seeing some bright spots in terms of the recovery around aviation. But I like to say, and I've said before, we're not out of the woods yet, but we're certainly seeing some really good signs that the recovery is on the right trajectory. And so we've assessed that, this recovery is being led by the leisure traveler, but we also recognize that we need the return of the business traveler and as well as the reopening of the international markets before we get back to the pre-COVID, employment levels. And we're anticipating that to be somewhere, or at least we're projecting around fiscal year 24-25. And although the timing, of both of these, when I talk about the business traveler and the international traveler, is still uncertain, there's still more encouraging signs every day that, again, these business travelers and the international travel returning is happening, particularly when we hear about European Union's recent announcement that they're going to allow fully vaccinated U.S. passengers to travel to Europe without a quarantine requirement. So again, just all points to positive signs towards full recovery. Now, in terms of the Port's response to the economic disruption, and particularly the disruption that was more prolonged than I think most of us had anticipated, we made some additional cost reductions this past year, which included implementing an early retirement and voluntary separation program. And you'll see as part of our fiscal year 22 budget that reflects a reduction of roughly 34 positions, which translates into reduced operating expenses around $5 million. And we felt these measures were needed, particularly to focus on preserving liquidity, maintaining adequate cash flow to ensure that we could pay our bills and pay our debt service as we manage through, again, like I mentioned before, this protracted recovery. further, and the good news is that the federal government stepped up and stepped in and provided, federal stimulus, and it's been critical in supporting and preserving, again, our liquidity position and replacing the revenue that otherwise would have been lost, given the effects of the pandemic. At the beginning of 22, around the spring of 22, we were able to fully draw down on about $72.5 million of the CARES funding, and that was allocated to PDX. And we're now, because of a second set of stimulus, able to draw down on approximately $19 million. That is the CARISA, or the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act. Because of that, we'll have some additional funding that will impact our fiscal year 21. Then there is the third part of the stimulus. The airport has been awarded an allocation known through the American Rescue Plan. It hasn't been formally announced yet in terms of the size of that allocation, so we're planning on that. But we have not budgeted that potential funding source into our fiscal 22 budget as of yet. But once the award is allocated and it's clear what the amount will be, we'll complete an evaluation and analysis as to how best to appropriate these funds. And it's likely that we'll spread some of those funds over 2 fiscal periods for fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23. But once the evaluation is complete internally and our analysis, we'll process a supplemental budget to make sure that we account for the portion that we intend to allocate and draw down in fiscal year 22. Just in terms of our general fund, we're fortunate that our operations continue to do well despite numerous pandemic challenges. We're particularly encouraged by the success of our weekly container service by the South Korean-based carrier SM Line, as well as the BNSF container intermodal rail service that goes to the Puget Sound region. And I just would like to say thanks to these services and the incredible efforts and productivity and the commitment to safety by our longshoremen workers at Terminal 6. We continue to be able to provide critical global market access throughout the region. In terms of Portland Harbor Superfund, our work continues here, and it continues to address our Superfund obligations. In terms of fiscal year 22, we expect our efforts will continue as we work towards achieving 100% of the cleanup sites that will be in the remedial design phase. In terms of our capital program, just aligned with our port strategic objective to build an airport for the future, capital construction continues as we move forward with our PDX Next capital program. Continuing the capital construction at PDX ensures that the airport is positioned for future growth and will continue to serve our region through this economic recovery and for years to come. Several projects will be completed later this fall as part of that program, including the additional public parking structure and consolidated rental car facility, as well as the rental car customer service center and the newly renovated Concourse B. Work also continues on the main project, the terminal core, which is a central part of the terminal, which will allow greater flexibility for our travelers and will ensure adequate security, capacity, more efficiency in terms of the processing passengers, and just overall improvement in terms of addressing seismic resiliency. So we're excited as the capital program progresses, and we're definitely looking forward to the return of robust air travel. And when I think about it, we're here 1 year later. As I stated before, just I'm going into this year with a renewed sense of optimism and hope as our markets open and as our region and our nation and our world recover from this just horrific pandemic that we've all had to endure. So we recognize there's still uncertainty in the recovery, but again, light at the end of the tunnel, and we'll continue to manage the port as fiscally conservatively as we can to ensure that over the years the port is well positioned to manage through this uncertainty and through to full recovery in the years ahead. So with that, I'm going to, it is my pleasure to turn it back over to the chairman, and we'll be prepared to answer questions. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ms. Chandler. Thank you, Ms. Chandler.
Mr. Chair, can I just insert myself one last time here? I apologize.
Sure.
Yeah, I inadvertently left two of our guests off in my introductions, and I just want to introduce them briefly if I could, because they're my bosses. I mentioned Commissioner O'Halloran, but Commissioner Stuart Strader and Commissioner Pat McDonald also join us today. So I want to thank the commissioners for joining, port commissioners. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. Now we'll begin with our questions. And my first question, you've pretty much answered part of it, and that was how much federal money you've received, and I think you've given us a good accounting of that. But we'd like a little bit more understanding about how you used the money and what the conditions were that were associated with that money.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. And as I, mentioned in my opening remarks, we have been very fortunate to receive federal stimulus grants, and the two, just to earmark here, the two grants, the CARES and the CARISA programs, we received to date approximately $91.4 million. And this funding really was used primarily to help mitigate a portion of the financial impacts of the pandemic in both the fiscal years, as I mentioned earlier, 2020 and 2021. And the funds have been critical in helping to support and preserve liquidity, again, to maintain, adequate cash flow, just given all the effects of the pandemic and the adverse effects, I should say, in terms of the air travel and the revenue loss. And so what we have been able to, the gap that we've been able to fill with this stimulus is the replacement of our lost parking revenue, airline and concession revenue, and also we've used some of those funds to maintain compliance with some of our debt covenants, particularly around our customer facility charge financing our bonds there. We've also been able to share some of this, some of the stimulus funding with our airport tenants and customers in the form of rent deferrals and rent abatements. And as I mentioned previously, PDX will receive, as I mentioned, the ARP, or the American Rescue Plan. We anticipate about $69 million that we will receive there, and again, that'll be spread over two fiscal periods there. And so again, the stimulus has helped us in terms of operation and maintenance, debt service, being able to partner with our business partners on the concession side in terms of terminal concessionaires and our rental car partners, and provide relief in that way. And I would just, again, like to add that we are very grateful for our representatives in Washington, D.C. for recognizing the need that the airports have and for working, really quickly to help provide those necessary resources.
Okay, thank you.
I have the next question. While the federal stimulus certainly has helped to mitigate some of the losses associated with the pandemic, we know you've also actively reduced operating expenses, including eliminating positions, to be able to maintain cash flow and pay operating expenses. At any point this past year, what were the risks of not being able to make any of those payments? And thinking forward also to, as federal funds start to diminish, are there risks associated with not being able to pay operating expenses moving forward?
Yes, so just in terms of the previous fiscal period, we did not I would say no in terms of any risks of being able to pay our debt service. The fortunate position that the port was in, we were really in a strong financial position, and because of our commitment to being fiscally conservative, that really helped us to persevere through this crisis. So we really were never at risk of not being able to meet any of our financial obligations, whether on the operating side or in terms of making any debt payments. And I would say that there are three drivers that really ensured that we could continue to be in a solid financial position going forward given the pandemic. You know, our leadership really stepped up very quickly and made sure that they understood which triggers they could pull in order to be able to preserve our cash flow and our liquidity. And those really, it was the three drivers were the reduction of operating expenses. So we've been able over that time period to reduce about 21 million in our operating expenses. And I referenced the roughly 5 million that came from the voluntary layoff program. But that was also the other contributors were our foregoing annual merit, again, the furlough program, putting a freeze on hiring, and then just operationally finding other ways that we could, reduce travel, if you will, just to cut costs in that way. And then the second big driver in terms of us being able to reduce those expenses came in the way of reevaluating our capital program and making some decisions on a project-by-project basis to reduce our capital commitments. And so we were able to defer about $200 million in capital projects. And strategically, again, the backstop, the biggest backstop there was really, or one of the contributors was our federal stimulus funding. And so I think as we look to go forward, one of the reasons that I mentioned earlier, we talked about being very prudent in how we apply the forthcoming ARP monies. And so to the extent that it is comes in somewhere around 69 or 70 million, we're going to look to allocate that over 22 and 23. And that's really to anticipate what may be some retraction in the economy in the event that air travel doesn't pick up in the way that we had anticipated. Because again, I mentioned that what's driving the recovery now is leisure. And so we do need the business traveler and the international portion of our business to come back, but I would say primarily the business traveler to really drive that bottom line. So I don't see, to get back to your question, I don't see, given the financial condition that we're in right now and how we're going to apply those federal stimulus dollars, that we'll have any challenges with meeting our debt obligations and meeting our operational commitments.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up to that that's also it's kind of actually a component of the next question, but I think it makes more sense maybe to ask it here, which is CFO Chandler, really nice to meet you, and thanks for your thorough answers this morning. That last part that you mentioned about the importance of the business traveler, coming back, as society is changing, I mean, is the port picturing that business travel is going to look the way that it did pre-pandemic? It certainly seems like, many employers in the area have switched to remote, and I know the port, has done some of that as well throughout the pandemic. Are you picturing that things are going to return to exactly the way they were, or what's the port thinking for that?
Yeah, I'm going to answer a small part of that, and then I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague who definitely will be able to respond to that question a little more appropriately. But let me at least just talk from the standpoint of the trends that we're seeing, and then he can pick up from there. So as we know, the business traveler has continued to be down some, 80, 85%, and they've been pretty consistent in terms of flatlining in terms of their activity since the pandemic hit. The bright spot, though, once we got through a measured approach to getting vaccinations across this country, and people started to get more confidence in terms of coming back to air travel, we're starting to see that trajectory change a little bit. And I think as recently as this past month, that number has gone up to about 71% down. So the natural question is, wow, it's still down 70%, right? But it is trending, I think, in the right direction. And I can't tell you that I know for sure that it'll come back 100%. I think there are some strategies, obviously, around how organizations will continue to operate in maybe a hybrid environment, but there'll still be a need for the business traveler. Still to be determined, I think, how much it comes back, but I am certainly optimistic that based on the trajectory and the trends that we're seeing so far and the activity and the research that I've been reading, that the business traveler will come back. Again, not suggesting that it will be full throttle, but I'm going to turn this over to Keith and let him answer that probably much better than me.
Keith Levitt here, Chief Trade and Equitable Development Officer, and I really don't have a lot to add to that. I think Antoinette really nailed it. We do keep track both kind of nationally of the statistics. We've got a consulting firm that is keeping a very close eye on what's happening with both leisure and business. But I'd say more importantly, what's important to our market as an O&D market is that we're staying close to the business travel community locally. So the Nikes and the Intels and the Adidas and the other major global business travel companies, they all report that they expect to get back to travel, but it will probably coincide with getting back to the office. And they're a lot like we are on the West Coast, where most of us are still operating remotely. And I think once we get to the fall and we get a little more back into a normal office situation, we're going to start to see business travel pick back up. And I would say the industry experts and certainly the airlines believe that while it's going to lag leisure, it is going to come back. It's going to take longer. I do think that when we think about what's going to happen with business travel, the one part that could fundamentally get impacted is Commissioner O'Halloran, who is on this call, used to be with Nike. And one of the questions is businesses going to meet with their own staff. And, just as a person that's been on a lot of the international flights out of Portland, a lot of that front cabin, frankly, is a lot of Nike folks that we know are going to meet with their offices overseas. And, can they do more of that by, Zoom? I think that's the key question. We know that businesses will meet with their customers. We know B2B will be happening. There is this question around how much flying cannot happen if people are their staff to staff is meeting over Zoom or Teams or whatever the right software is.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. Look forward. So,
could I ask a follow-up?
Yes, of course.
Sure, go.
Yes.
Oh no, Margot, we're getting a lot of feedback.
Yeah, I know. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes?
It sounds much better than.
All right, let's try this. In addition to just thinking about when business returns to what we considered normal in the past, we've already met with Metro and talked about the convention business. We met yesterday with the city of Portland, and we talked about perception and damage to reputation. Do you have any concerns at the port about people's interest, business or leisure, in returning to the Portland market under kind of the current cloud?
We do. Let me take that. It's Curtis Robinhold. You know, as Keith mentioned, we stay pretty close to the industry, including travel partners like Travel Portland and Travel Oregon. And we've been in discussions with the mayor's office as well. And we're participating in one of these tables that Mayor Wheeler has set to help address some of these issues around reputation. And I think that, you know, we have a fair amount of confidence that we come back, and that it is misguided to think that we are not going to return to some vibrant level. But, you know, I think the long-term view, worth noting, we annualize about 2.3% passenger growth a year over the long haul. So we think we'll get back to that, but the reputation deficit here is something that we need to address. So we've joined the mayor's table. We work with our travel partners to do that. Some of the first hurdle stuff is around health and well-being, right? It's not about is Portland a hit market to visit? It's is it a safe place? Is anywhere a safe place to go? And have you addressed those primary issues of concern? I think we're now getting over that, especially as we hit 70% vaccine. You're getting into that next level of conversation about attractiveness of market. But we are seeing significant growth here in the last weeks and months. Actually, Harmony's travel is a good example. People are getting back on a plane for the first time, and I think that will begin to happen, and then it will be on us to work with our partners to make sure we're cleaning up downtown, we're getting people to reopen businesses. And you know, we think, as Keith referred to, we're planning on coming back to our offices in a more, we actually have proposed a 3 days on, 2 days flex model for people who are in the office. And we're going to do that beginning around Labor Day. So we think that's probably, there'll be lots of leisure travel here, but the business push and the slower return, obviously it's incumbent on us to help address some of those concerns about safety, about the culture downtown and in the region. But we're pretty bullish on the regional economy and a return.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
Thanks. So now I have a question. We covered part of it, but with the increased distribution of the vaccine, air travel is beginning to increase. And like Harmony, actually, I took a flight on Friday, and I'm in Los Angeles right now, seeing my dad for the first time in a year and a half. So thank you. It was a smooth process at PDX. Seems like you have it dialed in. So this is a question about when, and you talked about in the opening statements, kind of, staircase to, continuing to be below pre-pandemic levels. We're wondering what year, you estimate that things will be back at pre-pandemic levels. And then outside of, the conversation that we just had about business travel, if there were any other significant changes that you anticipate sticking with us post pandemic.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of quickly hit on a few points that I know we touched on, but we are, when I always look back at kind of the remarkable year. A year ago, the uncertainty level was extreme. We were engaging at our executive team level in a lot of scenario planning. We landed on a U-shaped recovery, and it's fair to say that we feel like we're still in a U, but the trough of the U was longer. It was a more stubborn trough, but we are on the upside now of the U, and I think we expect the velocity of air travel and enplanements is going to continue to pick up. In fact, in April to May, it was 44% down. In May, it's 38% down. We think there's probably going to be a travel bubble here that pushes on forward throughout the summer and into next year. So, and again, that's driven a lot by leisure. Big picture, I guess I'll just hit again on the questions around fundamental changes are probably a little less on the leisure side and a little more on how much business activity can be done, or businesses choose to do business activity via Zoom and or Teams or whatever the right software engine is. And that still is the outstanding question. But, you know, I work with a lot of the people that have been through the ups and downs of airline travel for many years, and they're all, you know, bullish on, yeah, it may take a while, but we're going to get back to kind of a more normal cadence of travel, both business and leisure.
Thanks. Was anyone else going to weigh in on that one? If not, I actually have a follow-up that's a little bit tangential as well. Okay, so the other aspect that we have talked about in years past with kind of plans, especially around air travel, was some improvements in sustainability. I'm sorry, I mean environmental sustainability. And I wondered, and we have some questions later about, you know, opportunities during the, you know, pandemic to do capital stuff. But I wondered if any of the kind of plans around environmental sustainability, I remember you had a kind of a few different, you know, initiatives, and if any of that was affected, either put on hold or accelerated, or, you know, new shift for any of the environmental sustainability efforts that you've been looking at in air travel.
It's Curtis. You know, I'm going to call on Vince Granato here in a second, and he can talk to some of, as you noted, James, the construction element is a big chunk of where the investment variable is, and we've continued on that path for certain. On the operational side, we've continued with the planned improvements, including a shift broadly into LEDs, pushing and working with our airline partners on the ground service equipment to see about electrifying. We have proceeded with the electrification at the boarding gates without getting too arcane about what we're talking about. So we're continuing to push toward more electrical uses, and we actually just commission approved earlier today an improvement to grid connectivity out at the airport. So we're going to do some upgrades to help back up a new, more electrically reliant airport, but we feel pretty good about the process. And I wouldn't say the pandemic has interrupted any of those on the operations side. Maybe Vince, if you would just briefly speak to the project side, because I know we have a few big elements that we're really pushing on the construction side.
Sure, Vince Granato. I'm in charge of the PDX Next program, and yeah, we're continuing on the sustainability opportunities that we have. So one of the big components for the big terminal core project is putting in a ground source heat pump. And you know, there was a question about should we continue to do that, and of course we're gonna continue to do that. What that does is reduces our energy footprint by 50% per square foot by doing that particular component. So you know, that's probably the signature component of the environmental sustainability program within the Capitol. So at least on the terminal core project, but there are other, you know, smaller elements that we're doing too. Certainly all LED lighting, you know, kind of the standard things that we would do as well. But we're still continuing down that path.
Thanks, really appreciate it, and certainly 50% on the, you know, HVAC energy usage sounds really significant. So thanks for your continued investment in that, even during these up and down times.
Yeah. I have the next question, and James alluded to it. You know, with this pandemic, there have been a lot of dark days and very few silver linings, but one that we feel that we've identified, one that you talked to us about last year, was that with the pandemic, you were put in a position where you could actually accelerate some of your capital improvement programs. And so could you talk to us about those programs, those projects that you've been able to accelerate beyond your just, you know, hitting your deadlines and such, but actually brought further along or faster?
Sure, and I'll take that one as well. And I'd say, last year we had to make a determination about whether we should continue even with the projects. We really evaluated all of them, and we made the decision that given where everything was, we needed to continue because it would have been way too costly to stop or delay and so on. So we went through that whole process. And I think it was absolutely the right call. And as Curtis mentioned as well, the arc at the airport is very long term. We have had downturns, whether it's 9/11, the Great Recession, certainly this one as well. But we look at a very long arc, and passenger traffic roughly goes 2 to 3% per year. And so the facilities that we're building absolutely are designed to accommodate that. So when you look at the Terminal Core project, it is designed to take us out to 2035. And so we think it's still the right thing to do. The benefit that we got on the Terminal Core project was we were able to take a little bit more ground because there were fewer people in the building. So we modified our construction plan a little bit by taking, and for those of you who saw the terminal, it's a lot different than when you were out there last time, I'm sure. And we've closed off some areas a little bit sooner than what we had planned on doing that. We also took out a couple more gates, which allowed the Concourse B project to move a little bit faster, that we might not have been able to do if we were still at the high levels that we were back at in 2019. It doesn't change the overall end date of the project. The way I characterize it, though, is we really kind of de-risked the project by taking more ground. And when you have a construction project that lasts 5 years, there's a lot of opportunity for things to go wrong. So anything that we can get done sooner and more timely is going to be beneficial in the long run. And so we took those opportunities. I credit our contractors to having to work in a really difficult and challenging environment, and they modified how they did things. So we opened Concourse E last year, and we're still on track to open the new parking garage and the new rental car and office building in November of this year. In spite of all of these challenges, we've been able to stay on schedule. So overall, I think the team has done a really good job of being able to manage through this tough time.
Thank you very much.
This is Margot, hopefully without the feedback this time. We've been talking primarily about the operations at PDX because A, it's a big part of the biggest part of your business, and B, it's the one that we have some personal experience with as travelers. But let's talk about the rest of your operations. Last week, I happened to read in the State Economist's newscast that agricultural exports are doing well due to demand and higher commodity prices. So that made us start thinking about your freight operations. So because during the pandemic, so many people turned to our favorite vendor who seemed to miraculously deliver goods to Portland. So we'd like to know how has it affected your shipping, air freight in and out of Portland, containers, and particularly agricultural shipping?
Yeah, thank you for that. And this is Keith again. Yeah, it's that side of our business is a kind of the unsung hero, and it never is. Usually PDX is the bright, shiny star of the Port of Portland. And so it's a remarkable story. And I would just say that our air cargo business, as you would expect, grew a lot. So 20% up compared to pre-COVID. We have a all freighter service to Hong Kong with Cathay Pacific. They are an exciting partner of ours and of the state. But all of the mainline domestic carriers, the FedEx and the UPS and the Prime Air, all of that business, was fed and fueled by all of us staying at home. and ordering online. And, you know, the marine business is what is, I think, the most remarkable. We started the SM Korean-based ocean carrier service at Terminal 6 in January of 2020, at that time, China was in lockdown. And it was a scary time to be starting an Asia-based carrier service in an unknown kind of niche market like Portland at a container terminal that was empty for the last 4+ years. But nonetheless, they had a real vision. And this service, it started at about 450 moves a week per vessel. It's a weekly service, and it is now over 1,000 moves per week and is continually growing. A lot of that, again, owing to the significant demand for consumer goods being imported into the U.S. But the beauty of having that service here with a lot of import boxes on it is it allows for the exporters in our market, the farmers, largely agriculture shippers from all over Oregon, to access those containers and get them back to those Asia markets where they sell their products. And so there's a beautiful balance of trade that goes on in the Portland market that is unique. And the SM Line company has taken full advantage of that. And I would also say that but for the longshore workforce and the safety provisions and protocols that were adhered to in our seaport, we would not be sitting here celebrating the success of that operation. But our productivity was really high. Our partnerships with our labor unions are very high, and it's been a remarkable turnaround story in Portland. The other lines of business, just a real quick recap, we're in the grain bulk business at Terminal 5, the mineral bulk business at Terminal 5 and Terminal 4. We're a major auto player. All of those segments had pretty good years, not great years, but certainly not recession type volumes from those lines of business. And, finally, I think I would just highlight that a secret to our success on the marine side is diversification. We're a port that is involved in 4 different lines of marine business, some of which are risky, like containers, and some of which are just guaranteed lease revenue streams that help fund the overall portfolio. And it's because of that mix we're able to, withstand jolts in the marketplace and the ups and downs. But it truly has been a remarkable story.
Thank you. I have a couple of follow-ups. Number one, did you see the Port of Portland perhaps benefit from some of the slowdowns in other West Coast ports because they couldn't get stuff unloaded? And then number 2, you mentioned auto. Are you seeing any fall off in auto imports because of the supply issues?
Yeah, both really great questions. And again, I would say Portland, so we are a lot like PDX, we're an O&D container market. So we're not really feeding Chicago. And those containers stay in our market, in our Oregon-based Pacific Northwest market. So we have not, because our terminal is still, it's not full, we still have room to grow. We did not see a lot of port-related congestion, anything near like what you see up and down the West Coast. And yes, our marine team right now is entertaining lots of phone calls from various carriers wanting to come into Portland to just dump off and pick up containers, even if they're empty. And so we are a bit of a relief valve in that sense. We haven't yet taken new carriers in yet. We're very open to that concept. But the congestion you see everywhere else, you just don't see in Portland because of our niche market in the way that we operate here. And then I'm sorry, the second part of the question.
Auto supply.
Oh, auto supply, yeah. So a year ago, if we were talking, I'm sure it probably came up in the hearing a year ago, we did see significant impacts because of production, COVID affecting the factories in Asia. But as time went on, and I would say throughout last summer and kind of moving into the fall, and seeing the recession, that it was not a typical recession that was certainly, you know, that you would think of impacting the U.S. market. Demand for autos started to just pick back up, and so our volumes have been a bit patchy. They've been going up and down both on the export and the import side, but overall, it actually looks good.
Great, thank you so much.
Keith, I'm just going to be the acronym police here. When Keith is referring to O&D, it is origin and destination, and that is as opposed to a hub style market where products are coming in order to go someplace else. We tend, both on aviation and marine, to be either the beginning or the end of that trip rather than a halfway point where a port like LA Long Beach on the marine side is a real hub. Or Atlanta or Chicago on the aviation side. Those are hub airports where we are an origin and destination airport.
See, we always learn something when we come to the port. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks. Thanks for clarifying that. I definitely wondered about it the first time. Figured everyone else just knew what was going on. So switching gears, the port has developed a new guiding philosophy called shared prosperity, and I think you talked to us a little bit about that at the hearing last year. The budget message specifically talks about leaning into diversity, equity, and inclusion work and focusing on how to advance the regional economy in a way that generates and shares the wealth more equitably, and you also touched on that in your opening comments. What tangible things are we seeing in this year's budget that are related to that shared prosperity theme?
Yeah, this is Keith again, and I'll try to avoid the acronyms on this answer. You know, I would say tangibly, you see a lot in the budget. We've been through a pretty significant kind of piece of strategy work that we did last summer into the fall and winter. Which fed the budget process that's in front of you now, but we also went through a pretty significant restructuring within the organization. And so my title today is Chief Trade and Equitable Development Officer, whereas a year ago it was Chief Commercial Officer. We have really intentionally reformatted the commercial division that was, you know, very much focused on business development activity, revenue generation, economic development broadly in the region. And we've taken those skill sets and asked ourselves, how do we point that much more intentionally to these communities that have been left behind and that are falling further behind because of the pandemic? And, you know, I guess what I would say is the opportunity here for the port to drive meaningful impact is huge. You know, we are a very large economic player in our region. We're one of only a handful of what we call unified port authorities in the country, where you've got a seaport, an airport, and we own a lot of land, and we are very big in land development. You know, what we haven't done yet is really focus that work on those communities. And the budget has about 8 new positions in it that will join my team. They will join the development side. So we're really good at land development. I would say that's kind of our bread and butter. We have a robust properties team. We own a lot of land. and we built huge industrial parks. But what we're going to be so much more focused on going forward is how do we make sure the end uses at those industrial parks generate uplift for job quality within BIPOC communities, disabled communities, communities that are frankly underserved economically, and then how do they result in generational wealth opportunities through small business, the scaling of small business ability to access global markets, which the port plays a big role in as a leader in the state. So we're really excited about the work. We're at the beginning stage of the work, and as Antoinette knows, we have the interesting complexity that our business model requires that this type of activity pay for itself. We have to do this in a way where we're engaging the marketplace, delivering good uplift for the community economically, but also staying sustainable from a financial standpoint. I'm confident that we can figure that out, but that's very much the space that we're in right now as we evolve throughout this year.
That's really interesting, that last point. Yeah, it's just a different thing to think about. We are really interested in this and have been tracking, your work on it over the last several budgets. We talk to a lot of districts, and I think that they're, in terms of maturity and sophistication, districts are doing different things, and often it starts with, how can we change internally our hiring practices and other kind of policies that we, have complete span of control over. And I think, it grows to the work that you're engaging with now of, we're a huge enterprise, lots of land, employees, ways that we interface with society as a whole, and how can we make sure that provides nudges and provides, uplift like you were talking about. So we are excited about seeing where you take it. I did have one small follow-up, which is you mentioned a number of really exciting initiatives. I wondered if there are other ports or organizations that you're looking to that you think do slices of this well, that you're thinking, provide a model, or if it's, if this solution, some part of it, of course, will be Oregon grown because, you're a unique entity, but are there parts that you think, we want to do whatever Atlanta or Chicago or, some other entities are doing well?
It's a great question. And part of, I've got, in fact, one of my new hires, we just joined a national think tank organization of economic development organizations. We're the only port right now, but they're made up of foundations, they're made up of local government, and they are very much focused on sharing and benchmarking together around how you drive equitable economic development. And I think I'll be excited to report back next year on what we've learned, not only on the ground in our experience here. We know that Metro and Prosper Portland and the city and the state, everybody is in the space. They want to do this work, but I'm really excited to learn from what's happening in other markets throughout the country, which, we know we're not the first to get involved here, but we are kind of, I would say, unique from the standpoint of being able to drive some of these changes through our spending power on the project side, and then through our development work on the ground. And that's a little bit of a different flavor of an economic development organization.
I'll just note, if I could add on very briefly, we have been adding, and this budget includes positions that are not just in economic development doing this work, including a position in DEI to deal with workforce issues and to partner with the trades to build pipelines. It includes a position around our mentor protege program to build firms that can serve the port, but the community more broadly. And we are getting inquiries from other ports about how we're doing our work. And that, we're proud about that, but we also feel like this is a journey that we have more to learn on. So it's a nice trade. There's a national organization as well around airports specifically and how they're entering the space. So as Keith noted, we do try to learn from our partners and friends and colleagues in the space as well.
Thank you.
Can I ask a brief follow-up on this? Yeah, thank you. My question has to do with something you probably have been doing for a long, long time. I just don't remember it from last year or the year before. Do you produce an annual MWESB contract allotment sheet? And if you do, how is it trending? MWESB is Minority Women Emerging Small Business Expenditures. So if you're doing something in that area, is that something that has been flat, trending up, trending down? What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, let me start, and then I'll also ask Bobby Stedman, our Chief Administrative and Equity Officer, if she can chime in as well. We do track it. We also publish our numbers on our website because we really do believe in transparency on this topic. Our commission has also been very supportive of us really focusing on this work, understanding that it might have impacts on timeline or on cost, but that it's an important part of our job. And I'd say for the most part, we actually track, I'm going to go out here and maybe Bobby will correct me after, 3 big buckets because we have 2 federal programs around the airport and the state MWESB, which now has, as you probably know, a veterans component as well. But we've done really well on things like airport concessions, which is a specific FAA guided program. We've done pretty well on the others with, I'd say, incremental improvements, but on the project that Vince Granado described earlier, the big airport project, we're really deeply engaged with our partners on getting those numbers up. And some of that is on the type of work and the availability of providers, but we have done well, and we, at the Commission's direction, we include in each of our project proposals what portion of the project is going to a small business enterprise or MWESB, depending on the project. Bobby, are you available to help with this at all? Well,
I am, but I'm sorry. I just had to take a bio break. So I'm sorry I missed the question.
It was, are we tracking MWESB, SBE, ACDBE? I explained that we have 3 different primary programs and we publish on the website. And how are we doing? My response was, generally we're doing well, incremental improvements. Not every year is up, but we've also tried to integrate that into every case we make in front of the commission. And maybe there's nothing to add there except unless you have comment otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, we do report on that on an annual basis to commission and are currently hitting our targets and in some respects exceeding them. We've had a challenge, and Curtis, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, just on our Packer project this year, where we aren't meeting those specific goals, but overall, we are trending towards hitting our targets for all 3 categories.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bobby.
Yeah, sorry.
I have the next question. There was an article in the Oregonian earlier this year about shared prosperity that referenced the Port of Portland looking at alternative uses or sale of major assets to further the initiative. Can you tell us more about the port's goals and the plans to advance these initiatives? And do these plans include selling or repurposing any assets next year?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll take this one. Short answer, as Keith described earlier, is the port really is a revenue-driven operation. 96% of our revenues come through transactions, business transactions. Only 4% is the property tax element. So I should say in a normal year, this year has been somewhat different because of the federal funds that Antoinette described earlier. But we're really trying to balance that revenue-driven model with a desire to have broader impacts in the community. And so what that led us to, through the work that both Antoinette and Keith described, is a real evaluation of strategy about how are we handling and exercising what leverage we do have with our existing assets. That work essentially identified two primary opportunities that we think we can pursue in the near to mid future. What we want to do is engage with the community around those conversations to make sure we're aligned with the community on what our assets are doing. Those two assets that we have in mind for the, call it, some movement this year and in the next year or two, potentially disposition in some way, are Terminal 2 and West Hayden Island. We know that these assets could do more in the community than they are today, and we really want to better understand with the community what that means. So in the short term, our fiscal 22 budget doesn't contemplate the disposition of those assets in the budget cycle, but we do have some funds committed to further develop those two opportunities and see what they mean. They may be disposals. I'm guessing, at least in the case of T2, it's more likely repurposing that asset to create more value for the community and hopefully maintain some sustainability, as Keith described, for the port, where you're balancing that productive community asset with the need to maintain financial viability. So more work to be done, but we really are committed to using our assets in the, I'd say, the most impactful way that we can, and build wealth in communities who've previously been left behind.
Thanks.
I have the honor of asking this year's Portland Harbor Superfund question. And we've noted some movement, and that's encouraging. The significant milestone achieved with the EPA finalizing the agreement to develop the detailed cleanup plans for the Swan Island portion of the Portland Harbor Superfund. We also noted that DEQ issued the final cleanup plan for Willamette Cove earlier this year. Where is the port section of the cleanup, and when will the cleanup begin? What will the port's role be in that cleanup?
Absolutely. Here we go with one more step in Portland Harbor Superfund, but it's actually, there's movement, there's action. So we're excited to talk about it. Again, Kristen Leonard, Chief Public Affairs Officer. And to the question, what I'd like to speak to is this announcement from DEQ and their issuance of the final cleanup plan for Willamette Cove, but this is upland. So just to kind of in all of our minds separate all of our work with EPA within the river and sediment, this is different. This is the upland cleanup that we are going to be working on at Willamette Cove. So DEQ issued its final cleanup plan for Willamette Cove here in March 2021. This was a major milestone in this project. We've been working on this for 2 decades. So it preceded probably all of us in conversations and presentations to all of you, but Metro is the current landowner of this site, and the port is a former owner of a portion of the site. So we own the central parcel from 1903 to 1953. Since 2000, the Port and Metro have been under an agreement with DEQ to investigate and clean up the site. So this is thinking about sampling and some of that other kind of work as to what is actually there. And now this agreement jointly obligates both the Port and Metro to perform the required activities. And the next 2 to 3 years, we're anticipating, will be spent designing the cleanup. So you hear us referencing remedial design. That is coming up with the design, and then construction of the cleanup will follow completion of remedial design and will be done in conjunction with construction of the in-water cleanup remedy. A different conversation and a different agreement with some different parties and EPA. And the port's role in these constructions and the schedule for construction implementation is not known at this time, but we know we will be in this design phase for the next 2 to 3 years.
So to follow up on this, I envision a layered cake of sediments. And you talked about 03 to 1952. So in my visualization, I see it's, down somewhere quite a bit further down than the top layers. There are the ports layers. And do they take kind of an anthropological approach to this and identify which layers the port is responsible for? Or is the port responsible for collaborating and then working with everybody to clean all those layers up, regardless of whether they're actually their layers or not?
Oh, we have an entire technical team that right now would love to get into a deeper conversation about this, but I'm going to answer that question in reference to the larger harbor, so the 10-mile EPA Superfund site. There is an entire process that is in the works, has been for the last 2 decades, called the allocation process, and it is exactly what you've described. It is a process with a lot of potentially responsible parties, and everyone from their historians, technical advisors, and lawyers engaging in that conversation of what was any responsible party's level of responsibility. And that process has taken years. We are still a couple years out from some allocation decisions being made. But that process is what leads all of the potentially responsible parties or responsible parties to a deeper understanding of what their portion of the responsibility is. And that was a very simplistic, so I don't, we could spend a lot of time on Superfund, but it's a great question, and it's actually fascinating for starting to understand the history of this, basically Portland Harbor site and all of the background uses. And so we know we've been part of it for the last century, and so those discussions of what level of responsibility will come in the future.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer.
Yeah.
Great, I have the final question, and it's about the Urban Flood Control and Water Quality District. And we just had our second hearing with them a little while ago. They are now up and running and moving forward into this current year. What role does the port have in working with this new district? And can you just kind of elaborate a little bit about how you're working with them?
Absolutely. And I remember this question from last year that you had just done your hearing. And so we don't need to go a lot into the background, certainly, of the creation. But we are an active participant. As you know, the law created an initial 17-member board of directors. The Port of Portland is specified in state statute to hold one of the 17 seats, with a director appointed by the Port Commission. And the position is currently held by Ann Gravitt, the Port's Federal Government Affairs and Policy Manager. So we sit on that 17-member board. At the same time, the Port is deeply involved in the work of all of the organizations. And as you all know better than anyone, there's a lot going on this front. So the Columbia Corridor Drainage Districts, the Levee Ready Columbia kind of oversight group, and the UFSWQD, which we'll have to work with them on branding just a little bit. But the Port recognizes the significant risks as a large, and actually the largest property owner behind the levees, and the importance of the ongoing work, and as well as the opportunities presented for our region in reducing risks on a lot of fronts. So we are very active participants.
Great. I know managing a 17-member board is quite a challenge for them, but they got it up and running. We were very impressed.
They did.
Okay, with that, that's the end of our formal questions. Thank you for your contributions to this discussion. I will now ask Craig if any member has signed up since we last checked.
No, sir. No one has signed up that I have seen. Anybody on the port side?
Nope. I
No,
think we're
Craig,
all
we
set.
haven't received anything through the
Okay, thank you,
email.
Suzanne.
Great. So with no speakers signed up, I will now close our hearing and open up a regular meeting of the TSCC. And I'll ask if any commissioners have any comments on today's budget that we looked at. If not, I'll ask Executive Director Craig Gibbons to review the staff recommendation for the certification letter.
We are recommending that the commission certify the budget with one recommendation. And that recommendation is that the district do something more to try to avoid over expending appropriations. That happened as reported in the audit in 2020 fiscal year. And we recognize that it's very difficult given the nature of the business. But overexpending appropriations is counter to budget law. And so we recommend this, that the port, actually, the port's budget office and TSCC have discussed this at length. The port has submitted a letter to us telling us that they are going to be noting it more closely in the future. And I think that's the resolution that we were looking for.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. May I have a motion authorizing the commission to sign the certification letter as recommended by the staff?
This is James. I'll move.
So moved. Okay.
This is Margot. I'll second.
Great. Thank you. Any discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, nay. Okay, the motion carries. We will sign the certification letter. And thank you all for our meeting this morning. I think we're all done.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Nice
Thank
to
you.
meet the new additions, and thanks to your team for addressing that one issue and getting things over to us so quickly.